42, and if you're in your 20s, here's my top advice for you. Now, you definitely want to stick around for the last one because that's the one that will tie everything together and make it make sense. The first advice that I have is to ride the transitions between the fluid and crystallized states in your life. And what I mean by that is when you're a little bit younger, like 20s and earlier, you are going to have a much stronger raw processing power. And what that means is you learn things faster, you do things quicker, and you just understand and grasp things a lot quicker than someone in their 30s and 40s. And from the fluid state, you're going to transition into the crystallized state slowly but surely from your 30s and 40s. And no matter how fast you were in your youth, you are going to lose that fluidity because that's just how our brains work. In your 40s, what happens is you have more crystallized knowledge to draw upon. You have less power to acquire new knowledge, but you can still acquire it, of course, especially if you stay on top of your game. But what that means is essentially you should start looking at roles that focus on depth and wisdom. You need to make the right choices. You need to make the deep choices. You need to have insight. See a little further. And so essentially this maps onto our life stage pretty well. In your 20s, you should be looking for roles that are quick, agile, high upside, and just allows you to build and learn a lot of things really quickly. But as you get a little older, you need to settle down and really find roles that require you to make the right choices, not just the easiest choice in front of you or the fastest choice in front of you. So essentially, you'll be moving from innovative and speedy roles to ones that require more judgment and depth. Now, this principle also applies to personality. And when we're talking about personality, what happens is your personality will also shift throughout your life. And using the big 5 personality traits, we're talking about the trait agreeableness and trait conscientiousness will slowly increase as you get older. On the other hand, trait openness and trait neuroticism will decrease. And what that means is essentially you are going to be a little bit more of a team player as you get older. You're going to know how to compromise and work with other people a little better. And you'll also probably be a little bit more diligent with your work, not least because you're going to have more responsibilities in your life. You'll also be less nervous, and you'll also be probably less open-minded because you know what is tried and true, and your frames of references will be drawing on those previous experiences. So what does that mean? What that means is you should map your career and your life goals to how you will naturally develop. When you're a little bit younger, go for the wild swings. Try things that are a little bit more out there. Take more risks. You shouldn't be settling into that cushy corporate job when you're a little bit younger, because frankly, you're gonna lose all that advantage in the future. You should join that startup, you should take that risk. But as you're getting older, you probably want to do the opposite and de-risk a little, lean towards something more reliable and requiring more depth and judgment, right? And that's why it's important to get that clarity early. You wanna have that roadmap held loosely as you navigate life. And if gaming is a life of stages, personally for myself, I went to Korea to work when I was younger. I had my kids when I was younger. I took all the crazy risks, like applying to my master's, getting my doctorate when I was younger. And all of that allows me to be more present and juggle a lot of things just when I was younger, right? Now that I'm a little bit older, it's more about, whatever, planning for the next steps and what makes sense from here. And raising teens definitely requires more wisdom rather than just raw processing power, waking up in the middle of the night. And if life is about a transition from fluid to crystallized states, the next advice is really about how you leverage it. So let's talk about how you can spot these opportunities and use them properly. And this brings me to my second advice: play the leverage game. And what I mean by that is essentially doing less but getting more. And Archimedes is famous for saying, give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. In practical terms, leverage means using less time, money, effort to achieve more. So when I first started my YouTube channel, maybe 5-6 years ago, I had to script everything by hand. Nowadays, I still script everything by hand, but AI has become a much more powerful tool in just streamlining everything from editing, brainstorming ideas, and helping doing a little bit of the scripting, doing research, and all sorts of things. So it allows people to do a lot more with a lot less. And it's important to constantly look out for these kinds of tools. Another relatively recent example would be crypto, right? If you were one of the early adopters in just say like 2014, you put a little bit of money into Bitcoin, you're gonna be doing very well. I was a little bit later, I joined Ethereum and Bitcoin probably in the 2017s and did pretty well for it, right? So it's really about how you can identify those high upside items early and really leverage them. And all of this compounds into what's known as the Matthew principle, which is the rich get richer. Another way of framing it is success begets success, or the Pareto distribution: 20% of your efforts lead to 80% of your outcomes. So for example, if you look at a sports team, just say basketball, 80% of the points is probably scored by 20% of the players, whether it's actually scoring the points or assisting or perhaps sending an off-ball screen, which leads to the point, or taking pressure off the person who scores the point. So that's a sports example. In companies, it's quite similar. 80% of the company's earnings comes from 20% of their products and also of their teams. So this universal principle is there. And so think about it this way. What if you're able to dial up that 20%, so that's not 20%, but it's more like 30%? Then your gains will be so much more because you're able to maximize on what works well. So you really want to aim for the high yield actions. There's also what Jeff Bezos calls the long tail, which is big wins are hidden in the far ends of the curve. Essentially, leverage would help you go further with less. And what you really want to do is build something that is unstoppable, something that will grow in your sleep. And for that, you need to understand compounding. And it's not just about money. And my next advice is to really subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. But kidding aside, let's move to the actual next advice, which brings me to my third advice. Compounding goes far beyond money. It's also about networks. It's also about relationships. It's also about skills, location, and your community, and also your health. So compounding hits a lot of different things. So imagine this, if we combine this point about compounding with the previous point about leveraging, imagine if you're able to turn that 20% that yields the 80% of the gains to 40%. And if you're able to do that at an individual level, or your company is able to do that at a collective level, what that means is your gains would go up exponentially. And that's really the power of compounding with leverage. So the easy example would be finances, right? Because you can really see the numbers, it's really right in your face. So if you start early in your 20s, you start investing 5% of your income consistently into your bank account. And whether you put it in index funds, right? Everyone knows the advice nowadays is, oh, invest everything in the S&P 500, right? Well, do that. Right? And if you do that, you will see the gains early, and also be very meticulous with that decision, right? So for example, recently I found out, okay, the VOO, the Vanguard S&P 500 fund, charges 0.03% for its services. However, if you go with Fidelity, for example, you can buy the index fund FNIAX, which essentially is 0%. And that tracks the large cap companies. So it's not just purely S&P 500, but essentially it is the S&P 500. And what that means is that over time, if you start investing 5% of your income in your 20s and you fix that optimization where it's like you don't pay VOO 0.03% and you go with Fidelity instead and you go with the FNIAX, what that means over time is a significant number, right? It's no longer a small number, and that compounds. And if you're able to consistently do that in your 20s, you're gonna be set for your 30s and 40s. Or if you're able to just pile on more investments in your 30s, so because your net income has grown, ideally, by the time you're 30s, you can contribute 10% instead of 5%, right? Because 10% of your income when you're, just say, earning 120K is far different than 5% when you're earning 90K. The amount of disposable income is very different at that point. So if you're playing your cards right, 30s, 40s, 50s, you can slowly increase the percentages that you can put in your investments and just let that compound over time. You have stories where Warren Buffett has a crap ton of money because he's been investing for the longest time. So someone may have better year-over-year returns if they started investing in their 40s, but because Warren Buffett has been investing since he's in his teens, his net value is just so much bigger, right? So compounding is obvious for money. Now, skills compound too, and James Clear made it pretty clear in his book, Atomic Habits, that if you improve 1% every day for a whole year, you will be 37 times better. Right now, whether that is literally the case or not, like it's hard to measure skills in that kind of way. But the whole idea is invest in improving yourself a little bit every day, a certain skill. So whether you want to do YouTube, be consistent, keep filming, keep working on that craft so that you'll get better. When I go back and look at the videos I made perhaps 6, 7 years ago, I kind of cringe, right? And I'm pretty sure I'll cringe when I look at this video probably 6, 7 years later because, well, you would just be better because you keep on working on that craft. Health compounds as well. So if you invest early in building muscle mass, it's going to carry you a lot further. If you are in your 40s and you're going to do a certain mobility test and figure out you're able to do certain things, right? I think Peter Attia talks about that a lot on Joe Rogan. If you're able to do certain things, then it's going to carry you a lot further. But if you're not able to do that in your 40s, you're going to have a lot of issues. So that's why it's important in your 20s to start working on your health. And I want to give you an example of my own story, right? When I was in my 20s, one thing that happened was I started having a lot of lower back pain. I had plantar fasciitis because I was still riding on the fact that I felt I was young, but my body was clearly giving me signals that, hey, John, you're young, but you're working all the time now and you're not necessarily taking good care of your body. And it wasn't until in my late 20s that my body started breaking down that I started seeing like, hey, there's signs that I can't keep this up. So I invested probably a good 5 or 6 years of my life just working out a lot, right? And I built up pretty solid muscle mass at that point. And that muscle mass, I've maintained it and I've built it up pretty well in my mid-30s. And then I slowed down working out in my mid-30s and now I'm in my early 40s. And what happened was, well, all that muscle mass that I've built up has kept me afloat in my 40s, so that at this point in time in my life, I'm still playing ball with people in their 20s. I'm still doing martial arts. I'm still able to deliver pretty mean roundhouse kicks. And that muscle mass just carries me forward, right? And you need to maintain it. You need to invest in it. But this really highlights the point that health compounds over time. And especially if you're in your 20s, you will feel that you're pretty invincible. But I have friends who were in their 20s and they didn't take care of their bodies. Suddenly just boom, one day they snapped their Achilles, right? Like this random event, I had a friend, he was just playing, he jumped, he landed, snapped his Achilles. And it's like, well, stuff happens, you don't take care of your body. And for something like health, it's not only positive compounding, but negative compounding also applies, right? So for example, if you have a high sugar intake, which messes with your insulin resistance, which messes with your mood, which messes with your metabolism, and all the other horrible things that high sugar is associated with, what that's going to do is it's just going to make everything an uphill battle. Another thing that compounds is location, and this one hits me personally the hardest because since my adult life in my 20s, I've lived in multiple cities, right? So I've spent 5 years in Korea, a year at Penn, right, in Philadelphia, several years at Oxford, here on and off for my doctorate, several years in Toronto in my adult life as I was finished my doctorate doing field work, and also I spent a few years in Seattle, right, which is where I live right now. And I'm going to be moving to Calgary soon. And one of the things that I realized is that at each location, you build a network, you build some friends, and these relationships compound over time. And that's one of the things that I'm realizing that I'm starting to miss. While I have a lot of friends all around the world, and I see them on social media, I see them on Facebook, like I'm connected with a lot of people, but the relationships, the depth is kind of missing because I just haven't been there, right? Relationships compound over time, and that impacts both your personal life and also your professional life. So for example, why do people stick around in San Francisco, right? For Silicon Valley. And why stick around in Silicon Valley? Because you build a brand there. That's where all the people are. That's where all the conversations take place. And those relationships will compound over time as well. And so for me, myself, I've switched industries multiple times. I've switched from education to academia, to gaming, to YouTube, social media content creation. Like I've made these kind of jumps, and at every stop of the way I've made new friends and so on, but it's hard to really build these relationships and take them further unless you stick at a place for the long run, right? So just be mindful of that. Like location matters, your industry matters, like all these things will compound over time, and you don't want to lose out on that compound interest unless you're really thoughtful about this whole process. Now, mind you, I personally don't regret it because I've traveled the world, I've seen the world, and a lot of my stuff moving forward is going to be online. So that's kind of where I'm looking to compound in the future. But if you're not looking to do an online thing, then location really matters because friends, family, professional networks, it's all going to be based on location. So if compounding is about doubling down, then it's really important to have the perspective to really find the things that are overlooked. This brings me to my next advice, which is really embodied in a Chinese saying called "三人行必有我師." That's Cantonese, by the way, which means among 3 people walking together, one of them can definitely be my teacher. What that means is there's always something to learn from someone, right? No matter their age or background. So this isn't about avoiding being the smartest person in the room. Like people always say, like, if you're the smartest person in the room, then find a different room, right? No, it's not really about that. It's more about being humble and seeing and appreciating the other dimensions of people. When I was in my 20s, I was proud. I thought I knew a lot because I did have some pretty strong raw processing power as a kid, right? Like, I had a pretty good fluid intelligence. But as you get older, you start realizing like there's always something to learn from someone. So just yesterday, my son, he schooled me on chickens and Beyblade, right? So one of our neighbors has chickens in his backyard, and my son goes and hangs out with his son all the time. And my son's been holding chickens, taking up eggs, and just telling me about how chickens work. And I'm like, I eat eggs, but I've never really held chickens and done stuff with them and so on. But it's really interesting. You learn a lot, right? And then you start learning like, oh, okay, pasture raised versus free range versus all that stuff, and the nutritional differences between those eggs. So another thing that you could be learning, even amongst like the youngest kids, in my case, I have teenage daughters and they're dropping a lot of Gen Alpha slang. So one thing that I put together here is that Rizzler strip is skibbity, no cap. What did I just say? And it's interesting because you really can learn something from someone all the time. Another perspective on this Chinese saying is Carol Dweck's idea of a growth mindset, right? But here's a catch. If the 3 people that you surround yourself with all think like you really limit your opportunity for growth. So one thing that I heard that really resonates with me is if you're able to articulate the perspective of someone else who's standing opposite of you, and I'm not saying you should listen to everyone and everyone's opinion is equally valid and yada yada. Like, I think there is a hierarchy in terms of who's right and who's wrong, but I think ultimately it comes down to like a very simple test, right? If you're able to articulate someone's perspective that they're trying to, with the argument that they're trying to make better than they are making it, then you truly understand their idea. And therefore, you probably have the better perspective because you fully understand their idea, you've evaluated it, and you decided your idea is still better, right? So I'm not saying growth mindset, learn from everyone and everyone's equal. It's not the case. I think that there is a hierarchy of better ideas, but I think you need to put yourself in a space where you can always learn from someone. And this is especially applicable if you're in your 20s because you're going to be in a bubble, right? Growing up in high school and in college, you've probably surrounded yourself with everyone at similar life stages. But once you enter the workforce, you start experiencing and meeting different people at different life stages. And that's really a good opportunity for you to absorb and just see what's ahead of you. So like, when I was in my 20s, I had some mentors who were in their 40s, and that really gave me a perspective on what was to come and just be ready for that. And that's why I really believe it's important to step out of your bubble and start having these extra experiences, whether at a different geography or with different people, right? I know I literally just told you like, you need to stay at a place to compound, but there's also benefits to going and spreading horizons as well. And that really requires you to go and live somewhere different rather than just, being a tourist and go visiting it. And a lot of us in the global West, we have the ability to go visit different places and tourism, we buy some stuff here and there, we eat some nice food and, take some pictures and all that. But at the end of the day, do you truly understand it? Do you truly understand their different perspective? It's very different. So an example is when I was in my late 20s, I went to Penn and it was a very far left leaning school, right? I went to the School of Education, so imagine how far left that is. And then I learned a whole bunch of perspectives. And then I took all those perspectives and methodologies and just basically the world view, and I brought it over to Oxford for my PhD. And boy, I got skewered there because it was just simply a different perspective. And I had to reorient myself and deal with a lot of that adversity and just navigate like, hey, what do I truly think about it? Because I'm getting 2 different worldviews. And for those who don't know, Oxford at that time was still very classical liberal, and it still is for the most part nowadays. But that was really a challenge for me and a shock to my system. But stepping out of the Canadian bubble, going to Korea, going to the US, and then going to Oxford, it really shook me. But it helped me grow ultimately and really land on what I truly believe and help me frame my perspectives on life. So it's important therefore to really reframe failure or these encounters as feedback and opportunities to grow. And I think that's really and if I'm to look at this Chinese saying and what Carol Dweck's talking about for growth mindset, then that's really how I would perceive it. Another major benefit of doing this is you stop competing in crowded lanes, because at the end of the day, it's not about being the best. It's about being the only. And that's my next advice, the 5th advice, which is you don't have to be the best, you just have to be the only. It's largely credited to Jerry Garcia, who is the guitarist of the Grateful Dead. And this applies directly to your personal brand, right? Which is something that you're building in your 20s. And you will probably have that carry forward for the rest of your life. And I can give you an example in my own case, which is I've run teams in international education. I've finished my doctorate. I've been in the gaming industry. I've built my own online business. And all these things put together help me compile a really unique value proposition, because I have experience with marketing, education, coaching, UX research, and so on, right? So as these experiences are piling up, you become your unique self. And that's really ways to separate yourself from other people who may be a one-trick pony. And even quite recently when I was hiring, that's one of the things that I look out for, right? You know, what does this person bring to the team that no one else really brings, or what are their perspectives, so that it can really complement what everyone else is doing. And it's really these kinds of non-traditional combos that make a candidate pop. And so that being said, the next question is, well, what should you stack? And really we could frame these things in terms of hard skills and soft skills. So for soft skills, you need to learn how to sell. I think ultimately that's something that is highly underrated, especially for Asians. A lot of times we weren't taught how to sell as kids. We go to school and it's like, get good grades and you'll be fine. But ultimately, once you get to the workplace, you have to start advocating for yourself, advocating for your ideas, and really hoping that, you know, while you need to be great at what you do, you also need to know how to present it and push it so that you create buy-in and alignment and so on. These are all the soft skills that take time to really develop. And learning how to communicate with clarity with a story, these are all things that add up over time. And then the second thing you need to do is really layer in the hard skills, which includes financial literacy, math, logic, and how to think scientifically, right? These are all things that would add value over time. And of course, you can add other hard skills that are irreplaceable, such as, well, if you want to be a plumber, well, you gotta know how to plumb, right? But if you know how to sell, create content, and plumbing, you have a pretty good combo there. So nowadays, like even if you go online and you look at different content creators on TikTok, right? And when you go do your mindless doom scrolling, like some of the things that really catch my eye is like these dentist videos where these dental experts are just cleaning teeth. And it's like, wow, this is nasty, but it's so fascinating. Why can't I stop watching it, right? These are all unique skills that dentists would have put together with their social media marketing, with the content creation, with their dental skills, and all that, you know, just putting it all together. And I could spend hours just sitting there watching nasty teeth get cleaned up. But here's the thing, even if you have the best combo of skills in the world, at the end of the day, you are likely still trading time for money. The only freedom is financial freedom. And that brings me to my sixth advice. You really need to develop that financial literacy early. And I know I mentioned it in the earlier point about compounding, but this time I really want to focus on finances, because at my age, in my 40s, this is where you really see people having huge differences in terms of their financial outcomes, right? In your 20s, everyone's still poor, right? You're still paying off your college debts, just trying to make it work. You're still earning an income that's probably a little bit better than a minimum wage. But by the time you hit your 40s, man, it's so obvious, because you see the cars, you see the houses, you see the things that people wear. And of course, some people love to keep up with the Joneses and they look rich, but they're actually poor. And there's people who, you know, drive a crappy car, but are actually like super rich. Of course, these are all other examples, but like what I'm trying to say is in your 40s, these things really become apparent about decisions that you've made in your life. And that's why it's really important to develop this financial literacy early, so that time in the market beats timing the market, right? If you are constantly investing 5% over time, it's gonna be much better than buying that one dip right before Donald Trump said, hey, this is a good time to buy in April of 2025. So at the end of the day, there's only three ways to earn. You work for someone, you work for yourself, or you be an owner investor. And this whole idea can really be summed up in Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, right? Or at least his whole brand, where, you know, there's employee, there's self-employed, there's owner, and then there's investor. And ultimately, you want to move towards the last category, which is the investor category, because once you get to that point, people are just making money for you. And so it's really about understanding the golden rule, which is those with the gold makes the rules. If you don't have gold, you are a slave to your employer. That's just the bottom line. And that's one thing I had to learn personally. You know, I have a very nice house here. You're looking at it right now, but that was done at a cost where I had to take on a very large mortgage and I had to be house poor for a few years. And that really took a toll on us. We made things work, right? But at the end of the day, along the way, we made some pretty good financial decisions in the last 10 years. And what happens now is, well, I am now leaving my job at Warner Brothers and I'm able to transition into content creation. And now I have the ability to just make my own rules, right? I don't have to work for anyone anymore because, well, I don't have to, right? I can choose to do what I want to do. So I'm really moving from employee to self-employed / business owner. And I also have a huge chunk of money that's working for me as an investor. So for these 4 quadrants, you can be in multiple at the same time. And it's really about which one you want to put most of your eggs in. And ultimately, you want to allocate most of these eggs to the point of financial independence, right? So it's important to have the self-awareness to understand, where are you in terms of this journey, right? In terms of where you put your resources, and understanding, hey, the goal is ultimately financial independence so that you can do something that you truly love. And it's probably not exchanging time for money. And financial literacy isn't really that complicated. At the end of the day, it's just really learning how to navigate these things early. So if you're in the US and you have kids, you want to invest in the 529 early, at least have 5 years, so that it can turn into a Roth IRA for their kid in the future, so that they can have tax-free money in the long term, right? And that's succession planning and wealth planning and so on. Or perhaps if it's even like just doing some simple research. So in my case, I sold 2 houses recently, and one of the things that I learned was, oh wait, there are different ways of getting rebates so that you save yourself 15 to 20K in terms of using the agents. And it's like, well, I never knew that when I bought my first property, right? I really wish I did a little bit more research to figure that out. And a quick few hours can save you tens of thousands of dollars. So that's why it's important to understand a lot of your time should be dedicated to developing this financial literacy so that you know how to make use of your resources, so that you can get that compounding early, so that you can have this independence and freedom, really. And so that's why it's important to understand there's always more to learn. So if you're in debt, you can do something like look into cash flow indexing. If you're getting into mortgages, you can look at velocity banking to speed up the repayment. So if you are buying a house, you can look at Section 121 exclusions. So essentially in the US, if you own a house for 2 years or more, as an individual, you can get capital gains of 250K that is tax-free. Or if you're a couple, you can get 500K tax-free, right? And that has implications in terms of how long you hold a property for and whether it's a good idea to let go or not. And for taxes, you need to master tools like the HSA, which is triple tax advantage. And if you have one with your employer, definitely max it out. And there's other things like FSAs, 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs in Canada, RRSPs, TFSAs, RESPs, first-time home buyer accounts, and so on. So there's just a lot of different ways that you can optimize your finances just by gaining a little bit of financial literacy. And that's why it's so important to build that muscle early, because it compounds over time. However, financial literacy is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is what we call the hedonic treadmill and how to avoid it, which is my next advice, which is learn how to avoid the hedonic treadmill. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the most stressful times of my life came from a period where I had a little bit of financial success. And what happened as a result was we decided to upgrade our lifestyle, right? Buy a bigger house, which is this house you're looking at right now. I love it, but I also kind of hate it. On paper, the math worked, but in reality, it forced us to make a lot of compromises, and we essentially bit off more than we could chew. So a simple example would be a bigger house means more rooms, which means more furniture, which means more cleaning, which means more stuff, and essentially setting a higher bar for what feels normal. And the worst part is living in a high status neighborhood where everyone raises expectations and that's normal, right? And you start getting this distorted sense of what's normal, especially living in a city like Seattle or Toronto, or even when I lived in Korea. Those all gave a weird sense of what really feels normal and what's a good life. And it's not only setting expectations for myself, but also change the expectations for my wife, for my kids, and what they expect to be like, hey, what's normal, right? And so while you yourself may be okay and immune to it because you're self-aware, but how about the people around you and what's perceived as normal and equitable and fair and reasonable? So one thing that my kids experienced while they were in Toronto was when they went to school, a lot of kids had iPhones when they were like grade 4 or 5. They were bringing phones to school, they were scrolling through TikTok, and they were having their expectations molded by social media. And then because everyone had their own phones at school, other kids were like, I like to have one too. And my daughter comes home to me like, hey, I like to have one too. I'm like, well, wait a second, hold on. This is not normal, right? Or perhaps you can counter argue and say, what is normal? And I would argue that a kid, before they have the means to make any money, having the newest iPhone is not normal. And so this kind of stress I'm talking about here for the hedonic treadmill essentially would seep into every aspect of your life. And you start realizing that no matter how much you gain, your expectations move like the goalposts. So at the end of the day, you're not gonna win, because the more money you make, the more you're gonna spend, the more you upgrade your lifestyle. And that's why it's important to focus on intrinsic goals, not extrinsic goals. And remember, at the end of the day, it's not about how much you earn, but about how much you keep. And avoiding the hedonic treadmill is really just something you got to be self-aware about and really align with the important people in your life, whether it's your spouse, whether it's your kids, and start educating them early, or at least be on the same page in terms of what is reasonable. And all of this is hard work. And at the end of the day, everything is hard, and it's really about choosing the right kind of hard. And this brings me to my next advice, which is there are glass balls and there are rubber balls. And here's one of the most freeing truths that I learned in my 30s, right? And I actually made a video about this probably 6 years ago at this point. And if you haven't heard of this one, I like to reiterate it. It's really important to choose your hard, right? So working is hard, but depending on drugs like Ozempic is hard and expensive. Controlling your temper is hard, but breaking things such as your relationship and furniture is also hard. Saving money is hard, but being broke is hard. And as a sociologist, one of the things I tell my kids is being poor is expensive. And what that means is certain neighborhoods simply don't have banks or grocery stores because people there simply don't use those services. So you have to travel an extra long distance to get to a grocery store or a bank to use those services. And as a result, you end up spending more money. Same thing for education, right? You're not going to find para-school organizations such as tutors in poor neighborhoods because, well, no one's going to be paying for the services there. So you got to travel a little further. So at the end of the day, being disciplined with your money is hard, but being poor is also hard. Spiritual discipline is hard. Prayer or meditation daily is difficult, but feeling unmoored and ungrounded and lost is also very difficult. Even with an entrepreneurship, running a small business is hard, but scaling a big one is also hard. In your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you're gonna see difficult things all along the way, and you need to make the right choices in terms of what is the right kind of hard that you wanna challenge. And there are ones that you can't break, such as the glass ones, because once you break it, you're not gonna fix it. So if you break your health, that's going to be a very big issue in the long run. But there are other things that are rubber balls, like, you lose a job, just find another job, right? So it's important to choose the right balls as well as you're juggling it, which is the right ball that you want to choose. And the whole rubber ball and glass ball thing is actually from the Coca-Cola CEO, Brian Dyson, back in 1991, where he talked about life is about juggling balls, right? There are some rubber balls that bounce back, and there are some, like your health, that are glass balls that once you break it, you are going to be in trouble. And therefore, it's important to choose wisely. So now that you know everything is hard, the real question becomes, which hard is worth it? Which brings me to my next advice. Should we tolerate hard because of our passion? My answer to that is forget about passion. You want to get on a car, which stands for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Now, it also stands for car because it takes you to places, but that's a dad joke. Anyways, the point I want to make about car is that competence is the main thing behind serotonin, right? Which is what makes you feel good, makes you puff your chest up and say, like, I'm doing good, I'm feeling confident in what I do. Autonomy is a sense of independence to pursue what you want to pursue. So those dopamine hits which you get every time you accomplish something and you make progress. And relatedness is the sense of community, which is essentially the oxytocin that your body releases when you feel a sense of community. And these are the real big things that drive motivation. So oftentimes people say, like, let's pursue your passion, do what you're passionate about, and yada yada. That's not necessarily the best advice. The best advice is to really rely on one of these pillars, whether you're competent on something, meaning you're really good at it, which ultimately gives you a lot of freedom to call your shots, right? Be so good that people can't ignore you. And these are really the pillars of motivation that keeps people going in the long run. And I go in depth about this in a video called Choosing Your Career in Your 20s, which is one of my older videos. But essentially the core principle is it doesn't matter how hard you run if you're running in the wrong direction. And we really want to make sure that we align all of these aspects of motivation so that we're able to achieve what's meaningful to us and not just go on the hedonic treadmill, which is mostly filled with extrinsic motivators, things that are outside, like kind of like the carrot, which you pursue, but ultimately you want the motivation to come from the inside. And one way that I like to frame it is motivation is kind of like the engine that drives your car, but ultimately what matters is where you're going. And so really my next advice is about goals. And here's the thing. Goal setting is both overhyped and underhyped at the same time. Ultimately, it depends on how you do it. And Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland says it best, right? The Cheshire Cat, when it saw Alice walking down the trail And I asked her, hey, where do you want to go? And then Alice said, I don't know. And then the Cheshire Cat replied, if you don't know where you want to go, then any path will take you there. Ultimately, I think a lot of times the goals that we set in life, it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be something that is truly what you want. And you can also build on top of the idea with what James Clear talks about, right? You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And it's so ultimately it's about having the systems that drive you towards your goals, right? So having the motivation pieces that I mentioned earlier is not enough. You need to actually have the conscientiousness, put systems in place, routines in place to help you achieve these goals. So ultimately, consistency beats intensity. It's a tortoise and hare thing, right? The most successful athletes, they practice every day. The most successful YouTubers, they release content constantly because that's what works. And that's why if you're in your 20s, you really want to focus on showing up consistently, right? And one of my workout buddies, Mason, he talks about it best. If you miss a workout, it's fine. You can't go back in time and fix it. Focus on the next workout. Focus on showing up on the next one, right? And it's really focusing on improving that 1% every single day. And ultimately, the tortoise and the hare makes a lot of sense because that is what works. And that's why I said goals are overhyped, because if you don't have the systems in place to support you achieving these goals, it's actually a very torturous situation where you have an aspiration, this is what I want to do, but because you never work towards it, you put yourself in a situation where you are constantly punishing yourself psychologically, like, hey, I'm not doing this, I'm not making any progress in this. And that's a really sucky feeling. And that's why a lot of people nowadays who are raised in an education system which tells them, hey, you're special, you're great, there's no other you in the world. Well, if that's the case, that means you have a destiny that you have to fulfill, and the fact that you're not fulfilling that destiny, it's a strange form of cruel and unusual punishment that can come as a result. And that's why I recommend for goals to set 5-year plans and reverse engineer from that and adjust as needed. Because the reality of our world nowadays is that AI, technology, and other forms of development are just changing everything so rapidly that it's hard to have anything longer than a 5-year plan realistically. Now, in terms of the actual goals that you should set, I would recommend to set it in 3 areas. Set it in health, set it in wealth, and set it in meaning, right? So you're probably expecting me to say health, wealth, and happiness. I don't think happiness is a right way to frame it because happiness tends to be short-lived. What's more of a long-term form of fulfillment is meaning, doing something meaningful. So even though sometimes I will spend time with my family and it's sometimes not the best experience because it's just kind of like, I want to do this, I want to do this. I just can't spend time focusing on my family right now. Ultimately, the fulfillment is there, the meaning is there, because it's something that aligns with a long-term plan. Like I said earlier, it's all about balancing and juggling all these glass and rubber balls. And if possible, try to get an accountability partner to go on this journey with you. For something like health, what are some of the measurable goals that you want? Whether it's being able to do a certain move, whether it's having a certain figure, or being able to hit certain measurements such as BMI, body fat percentage, and all that stuff, right? That would be an example for health. For wealth, one of the things that my financial planner told me, which I found to be very insightful, is that a lot of people don't have a good idea of what is enough, right? So once again, it's about setting that goal, setting that number, and having data to back that number. Like, what amount of money is actually enough? How much do you need in your retirement to get that house, buy that car, go on that vacation, or go on retirement, right? Like, these are all things that you need to start putting numbers towards to have a clear goal so that you are not gonna keep torturing yourself over, I am behind, I'm not hitting these things. Because at the end of the day, you can't improve what you don't measure. And that lack of clarity leads to a constant low-level panic that you can feel. So Ramit Sethi, who talks a lot about financial planning, he talks about having a guilt-free budget so that you can spend money without feeling bad about it, essentially. Because no matter how well you plan, you are in a constant battle between who you are right now and who you strive to be in the future, which is my next point. How do you address this constant battle that you have within yourself? And at the heart of this issue is one thing: integrating what you know you should do with what you actually do, right? So in Chinese philosophy, we call it 知行合一, which is the unity, knowledge, and action. And that's why Jordan Peterson's second rule in his 12 rules for life is so powerful, right? You want to treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. And like I said earlier, it's okay to fail. What's important is picking yourself back up and also being kind to yourself and understanding, like, hey, sometimes we mess up. This is the core of the human struggle. You know what you should do versus what you actually do, because the spirit is willing and the body is weak, or if a system is weak. or something is weak, which leads you to fail to do actions that help you fulfill your goal, right? The goal that I mentioned earlier. So think of it this way, like if a friend missed the workout, you're not gonna curse them out. If you promise to meet someone important at 5 a.m. at the gym, you're gonna show up no matter what, right? The idea is really showing up for yourself so that you can live a guilt-free life. And that's what I find for a lot of people in their 40s, right? Because enough of your life has passed by where it's like you have enough regrets that are starting to pile up. And you start seeing, like I said earlier, you start seeing people being wealthier, healthier, having a better life, having kids, and so on. And meanwhile, you may not have that. And so that's something you got to be aware of in your 20s. Like all the things that you do add up in the future. And that's why the next point might be the most important one, because the battle between the present you and the future you may depend heavily on an ally or an enemy who you may choose to spend your life with, right? And hopefully you choose an ally and not an enemy. Which brings me to my next advice. Your spouse is going to be the most important investment in your life. And not only who you decide to spend your life with, but also how you decide to spend your life with this person. And the systems that you have in place to nurture this relationship is going to be critical, because like I mentioned earlier, your spouse is going to be there with you every step of the way. So they're going to be your accountability partner, they're going to be your therapist, they're going to be your cheerleader, they're going to be your financial co-planner, they're going to be your nutritionist, right? You're going to be your workout partner, everything really, your spiritual partner. And the Bible says in Genesis 2:24 that two will become one flesh. And Ephesians 5 further expands on what a union means in practice. So sure, there's always going to be things that you need to work out. And nowadays there's a lot of bashing of marriages, or certain cultures no longer really support it, or perhaps it's just the environment. But how I would frame it is, think of it as kind of like the other hemisphere, right? You kind of have the left brain and the right brain and talking. And they need to talk in order to make the best decision, because one, if you say one is the logical brain, the other one's the emotional brain, the true answer is probably somewhere in the middle, right? You want the best reasonable answer. Same thing. If you play baseball, right? If you swing the bat with one hand, it's going to be very difficult to aim, but it takes two hands to really figure out what's the right way to swing the bat so that you can actually hit the ball. Same analogy for shooting at the range or doing anything that requires two hands, such as driving, right? So ultimately, it takes two to tango to make the best decisions, and therefore the spouse is the most important decision, I would argue, that you're probably going to make in your life. From a financial perspective, which I've been talking about throughout the video, marriage is an awesome way of saving money, right? Shared rent, shared costs, shared goals, perhaps another income, depending on how you want to structure your marriage. These are all things that you need to take into consideration when you're in your 20s, because that's all going to build out and compound over time. And the irony is, like, even in situations where marriages don't work out, in a divorce, right? Co-parenting, right? When kids are involved, become a big thing. And ironically, couples have to communicate even more than before, which is probably why they got split up in the first place, to sort out how they're going to handle these kinds of responsibilities, and even forcing to have conversations about money on how to support the kids. And so it really shows you how central a spousal relationship is in all facets of your life. In my case, I met my wife as a teen. We grew up together, and I think it's a beautiful thing because we know where the other person came from, right? Their history. It's kind of like Memento, the movie by Christopher Nolan, that in order to know where you're going, you gotta know where you're from, right? And so from my perspective, getting this early is important. Teens is the best time to figure this out. If you're not, do it in your 20s, because the later it is, the more difficult it gets. And finally, I think the spouse is also going to be something that opens or closes the door for you for the next important thing in your life, which is my next advice, which is children. And that's why I would argue having kids is probably the best thing that could ever happen to you when you're an adult. And if you're in your 20s, which is why you're watching this video, and you don't have kids yet, there's a lot of nuances and certain dynamics that totally change once you have kids. So for example, before you have kids, you're gonna have friends because, hey, this person's chill, you like hanging out with them, and so on. But one thing you're gonna realize is that if both of you guys have kids at the same time, it's not gonna be like you and him or her. It's going to be your family and their family. And if your kids don't get along and they don't play nice with each other, you're probably not going to hang out with that family very often anymore. And oftentimes, as a result of having kids, your social circle and your integration into communities is going to be based on where your kids are hanging out. So if my kids go to a martial arts school, I'm going to be hanging out there a lot more. If my kids go to church, I'm going to be hanging out there a lot more. And of course, my wife and I, we would determine where we're going to spend our time. But ultimately, if that environment's not one that's conducive to our children's growth, we're not going to spend time there. right? So interestingly enough, kids are going to determine where you're going to spend most of your time. And that's why in your 20s and 30s, like the spousal decision is so important, because that's going to have downstream effects in terms of how you spend your time with your kids, your social circle, your friends, who you actually will hang out with. It's just gonna be very different. And that's essentially gonna change your whole social ecosystem, because you're gonna start noticing your adult friendships revolves around how you parent your kids, right? And nothing really kills a gathering more than a kid who's out of control and that nobody likes, but you have to kind of like them because they're your friend's kid, right? Over time, it will wear on everyone and no one wants to hang out. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but this whole parenting dynamic that you might not see in your 20s and 30s is important, because you want to get off to a good start. You want to raise your kids properly, the moment they were born, to prepare for this path. Not to say it's impossible to turn things around, but oftentimes a person's personality is more or less set by the time they're 5. So you got to be very mindful that the formative years, you want to be on top of these things. And that's why I put this advice here. So for people in their 20s, you're cognizant of this moving forward. And another thing is, you really want to be a good parent, not just for your kids, but for the whole world that they're growing into, right? And having poorly raised kids, makes them lose out on friendships, on mentors, on closing doors that would have been opened otherwise. So that's why you really want to make sure that when you have these kids, they're going to stretch you, they're going to make you a better person. You become more introspective and self-aware, because it's like, oh wait, because I did this, my children's now doing this. So you become a better person as a result. So it's kind of like iron sharpens iron. They really, sharpen you as a human being. And yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about money, because the fatherhood bonus is real. It's sociologically proven. People who are a parent typically have 6 to 15% more income than non-dads. And now I'm not claiming causality, because oftentimes people who have to provide for their family would tend to work, and that alone may account for it. Or perhaps there's a better environment to support them to do better work. So the causal mechanism isn't exactly clear. Maybe because being a father makes you step up. Perhaps there's a reverse situation where it's high quality men are the ones who are able to attract a spouse who would be willing to have kids with them, right? So fatherhood changes everything. And this brings me to my next point, which is, as you have multiple parties in your life, such as a spouse, kids, multiple kids, your life will get very complicated. And therefore it's important to find ways to simplify it as much as possible. And so really my next advice is simplify to amplify. And the example is this: the average person makes about 35,000 decisions a day. And I don't think anyone's really sitting there and measuring and counting it every time, because we're also talking about micro decisions, right? When you're at Starbucks, should I get an Americano, or should I get a cappuccino, or should I even walk into Starbucks, right? These are all micro decisions along the way that people make. So 35,000 a day doesn't sound too outlandish, but I think one of the things is that if they're small, they all add up and it becomes mentally taxing. And that's why you have high performers like Steve Jobs, who wears a turtleneck every day, right? He simplifies his life incredibly. I'm not saying we should all go minimalist and become Steve Jobs, but I think there's a point there where it's having a routine that makes your life easy. And so if you're in your 20s, right, you have a lot more flexibility, you have a lot of fluid intelligence that allows you to do different things. But as you move forward, you need to look at setting up routines and systems in place to support you in your long-term goals. And so having kids is a great way of doing that, because they force you in a routine. Just going to school from 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., that's a routine that pretty much locks you in, and it gives you that consistency in life. So that's a very natural way of simplifying everything, because at 3:30 you're gonna be there picking up your kids. You kind of have to, right? Unless you do after school programs, which is a whole other thing. But it's about setting up these systems, right? And it applies to pretty much everything across the board. Which credit card should you use? Choose one to stick with and maximize the points. Instead of juggling 5 investment accounts, probably just have 1 investment account, and so on, right? Just make life easier for yourself. And therefore, routines aren't restrictive. You need to reframe that as being efficient. And if you have kids, routine is non-negotiable. They have to wake up, they have to go to school, they have to eat, they have to sleep, and you have to make sure each step of the way it's taken care of. And of course, the spouse is very important, because it becomes a team effort where you work to maintain this routine. And so that's why it's so critical to focus on simplifying things, so that you can really focus on things that matter in life. In your 20s, a lot of things may seem like priorities, but if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And that's why you need to focus on simplifying things and really focus on the things that matter. Use systems or routines to help set your life up for success. But even with a good routine and a great marriage, there's still one thing that I feel that a lot of people overlook. And that's my next advice, which is find mentors, because I believe mentors are kind of like the cheat code to life. And I would define mentors as people who have gone further in life than you have, that have experience in things that you care about. And one of the things that they can do is they can help you spot problems before they even come up. And having worked in many different careers, one thing that's helped at each step of the way is having a mentor really map out what are the important things in that field, right? So I worked in education, I worked in academia, gaming, YouTube, my own business, and so on. And at each stop, I've proactively reached out to people, and these people save me so much time, money, and heartache because they're just able to tell you, hey, watch out for these things, or focus on these things that are going to give you the high upside, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. And another thing that I learned is that mentors don't map across industries oftentimes, unless you have like kind of like a life mentor, and that's kind of like a different thing. But oftentimes mentors tend to be very industry specific. So that's another thing you want to keep in mind, right? You kind of have a mentor that specializes in a certain facet of what you're looking to grow in. So another way to frame this is you'll probably need more than one mentor in life. And that's why I think it's important to set this relationship up front, to set these kinds of expectations in terms of how often you're planning to meet. What are you looking for in a mentor? And oftentimes people are very willing, and in fact, they're quite flattered to be a mentor, right? Unless they're like the super busy people who don't have time for this kind of stuff. But even then, they can pick and choose different people they want to mentor. And there's an inherent joy in that, right? Like I said, as people move towards crystallized states of intelligence, they want to pass on the knowledge. They want to move towards coaching, mentoring, and teaching rather than just hustling all the time, because at that point it becomes more about judgment and making good decisions, which is what mentorship is all about. They teach these things to you, or they reflect as they teach these things to you. And often people say in the education industry that it's the teachers who learn the topics the most because they're the ones who are constantly teaching it. And that's another benefit that mentors get. So don't feel like you're bothering them. If you are interested in someone being your mentor, just feel free to reach out to them and see if you can establish that kind of relationship. But ultimately, mentors simplify decisions. They see around the corners. They're able to ring the alarm bells earlier. And the truth is, the earlier you're able to spot the problem, the earlier you're able to fix it. And a small adjustment can save you from a world of hurt later on. But even with great mentors, it's not going to save you from hardship. Life is going to get tough, right? Like I said, you got to choose your heart. So my next advice is focusing on being grateful as a means of staying grounded and focusing on what matters. And what that means is you gotta live in the moment and approach it with gratitude. Nowadays, there's so much knowledge out there, there's so much information. We get just anxious thinking about the things that we could be doing instead of focusing on the present. And people tend to overthink, people tend to ruminate. And one of the most obvious instances of that is the rates of depression going up during COVID, where everyone couldn't see each other. And this whole rumination thing is literally the textbook definition of depression. And I once read something that I think is great, which is depression is living in the past, anxiety is living in the future, and gratitude is living in the present. And that really resonated with me because having done so many jumps in my life and going through so many transitions, one of the things that I realized is that I walked through a lot of dark valleys with there's family stress, there's health stress, there's family issues, there's job stress, there's just a lot of stress, right? And I'm not here to say like, oh, my stress is the woe is me, my stress is worse than the world. I'm sure there's people who have it worse than me, and you might have it worse than me. I don't know, right? But everyone, as you're going through it, it's probably the biggest challenge for you at the moment. And one truth that I've learned is that it can always get harder. Life can always get harder. Whether it's an unexpected bill, you get in a car accident, someone suddenly has a health issue which you got to go and support and take care of. There could be a million things that could go wrong in life, and you suddenly have to go and dedicate your full attention to it. And ultimately, I think because pain is inevitable, it's important to focus on what is the solution to pain, right? Now, I'm a Christian, so I would say like focus on God and Jesus. But for those who don't have that, gratitude is probably the next best thing, right? And so for myself, when I stop and pray, I count the blessings that I perhaps didn't notice or have neglected during that time. And while it doesn't change the situation at hand, it changes me. Because internally, you're able to refocus on like, hey, I should be grateful I'm still breathing. I should be grateful that I still have a family around me. And despite these adverse situations, there's still something going right in life. And so it's all about directing your attention to what you still have and not what you don't have. And there's a reason why prayer and meditation shows up in all religious traditions, because it is the basic human mechanism for you to reorient yourself during times of adversity, because ultimately it keeps you centered. Now that we've talked about gratitude, let's talk about the final most important advice. And if you haven't subscribed already and you've made it this far, What are you waiting for? Please give me a subscribe or a like, comment, let me know your thoughts. Let's move on to the final advice that I have, which is all about designing your life with the end in mind. And of course you're gonna be like, hey John, what are you talking about? I'm in my 20s and like how am I supposed to project where I'm gonna be when I'm 60 or 70? That's not what I mean. But I think there are some core fundamental human characteristics that is a shared experience amongst all humanity, right? Because we are all humans, we are all more or less in the same way. And there are also shared things that people in the past have told us, people who have gone before us have told us are the most important things in life. And Bronnie Ware, a palliative care nurse, which is a type of nurse that cares for people who are at their life's end, one of the things that she wrote about are the top 5 regrets of people dying. The first regret is, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself and not the life others expected of me. The second one is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. The third is, I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. The fourth is, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And the fifth is, I wish I had let myself be happier. So I think if this is the finding of people who are about to end their lives, and it's like the common themes that keep showing up, and these are warning signs for us to live a fulfilling life. And so I think this is very important advice on how to live a meaningful life. And now here's the thing, in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, at each point in your life, you're gonna feel there's gonna be things that are more urgent than others, right? And oftentimes the thing that's in front of you at that time is the most urgent thing. And that's completely normal. But the point that I want to make is that these regrets don't come from one decision. They come from repeated decisions over time that accumulate and build up. Like I said, 20s, 30s, 40s, you start seeing the results of years of decisions. 40s, 50s, 60s, why would that be any different? And so there's gonna be the fulfilled 60, 70, 80-year-old, and there's gonna be the very bitter and salty 67 and 80-year-old who are just filled with resentment. And that's why it's important to have a vision, a North Star on where you want to go in life. And it's not having a perfect plan because, like I said, plans fall apart. Everyone's got a plan until they're punched in the mouth. What about the famous Mike Tyson? But it's more like, you see a North Star, there's a path in front of you, there's mountains, you don't know how you're gonna navigate through the mountains, but as long as you focus on the North Star, that's what's gonna get you through, right? Like, you're gonna be okay as long as you keep following that North Star. Because now that I'm in my 40s, one thing I realize is that the grind doesn't really matter that much. What matters is the people, the relationships, and the experiences that you've had along the way, and all the growth and gratitude that comes as a result. And ideally, it's with a great spouse and loving kids. So if you found this video helpful, you might find this one helpful as well. Take care.